Hello, and welcome to the CORE webinar, There When You Need Us, Crisis Collecting Support. My name is Ann Kearney, and I'm a member of the CORE Preservation Outreach Committee. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Kara McClurkin and Vanessa St. Augerman. Vanessa St. Augerman is the Pan Am 103 Archivist and the Assistant University Archivist at the Syracuse University Library's Special Collections Research Center in Syracuse, New York. She served on the Society of American Archivists Tragedy Response Initiative Task Force and is currently co-chair of its Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group. In addition to her archival work, she's one of the primary advisors to the Remembrance and Lockerbie Scholars Program at Syracuse and a member of the advisory board of the victims of Pan Am Flight 103. Kara McClurkin is the Director of Preservation Services at the University of Virginia Library and oversees all activities related to physical and digital preservation. She also served on the Society of American Archivists Tragedy Response Initiative Task Force and, with Vanessa, is co-chair of the Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group. She also serves on the advisory committee for the Academic Preservation Trust, is a past chair of the Preservation section of the Society of American Archivists, and a past chair of the Preservation and Reformatting section of the American Library Association. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise. You can use the Zoom chat function to comment or communicate with other attendees. Please use the Q&A box if you have any questions for our presenter or need technical support. We can only minimally monitor the chat, and our primary focus is to monitor the Q&A box. We will have time for questions after the presentation. You may also comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is CORECE2023. We do not monitor the Twitter feed during the presentation. So if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the Zoom Q&A. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. CORE is committed to providing a harassment-free environment for everyone, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, disability, physical appearance, ethnicity, religion, or other group identity. To that extent, all webinar participants, including speakers and attendees, must comply with the CORE Statement of Conduct. I'll drop this link into the chat. Please contact me through private chat or email jreese@ala.org if you experience or witness any violations of the code. And now, here are our presenters.
Thank you so much, Anne. I will just get Kara's and my slides going here in just a moment. So again, thank you for that introduction, Anne. Kara and I are very pleased to be with you all this afternoon. We'll jump past our own introductions of ourselves a bit. I did just want to mention my reason for being interested in this type of work. I'm particularly interested in the long-term stewardship of tragedy-based collections. And so that's hopefully a perspective that I've brought to the work of the task force as well as the working group. Kara, did you want to talk a little bit about how you got involved?
Sure. So I've been at UVA for about 14 years, and over those 14 years, the University of Virginia has made the headlines, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in less positive ways. And we have been asked at the library to collect or document those events. And we have struggled sometimes with having workflows and staffing in place to do that in a quick manner. And when I thought about the fact that a place like UVA was having trouble with those things, then it was possible that other institutions were too. And so it made me interested in trying to see who else was doing this work and what we could do to collaborate instead of trying to reinvent the wheel ourselves. So that's why I'm interested in it.
So to get us really started today, Kara and I, although we are geographically separated, wanted to begin with the land acknowledgements from our respective institutions. So Kara, I'll pass things to you to begin.
Thank you. So at the University of Virginia Library in Charlottesville, we acknowledge that the land where we learn and work is the ancestral homeland and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation. We pay respects to their elders and knowledge keepers, past and present. We acknowledge and pay respect to the enslaved Africans, enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built UVA, as well as their descendants. Today, we acknowledge the land, we acknowledge the labor, traditions, and knowledge, and we acknowledge lives.
And at Syracuse University, we acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands our university now stands. So throughout our talk today, Kara and I will be covering quite a bit of ground. So to give you a preview of what's to come, we'll begin by defining some of the terms that we'll be using throughout the session today. We'll then move into providing some background on the working group and how it came to be. There will be an overview of Documenting in Times of Crisis, a resource kit, which is the main publication of our group. Then we'll have some discussion about how to prepare in advance and deciding whether or not to collect in the aftermath of a crisis, disaster, or tragedy. Carol will talk with us about the Crisis Collecting Assistance Team, which is one of our newer endeavors of the working group. And then, as Anne mentioned, at the end of today's session, we'll have some time for Q&A. So now I'll pass things over to Kara to get us started with defining some terms. Kara, you're muted.
Thank you, Vanessa. We thought that it would be helpful before we got it started to start with some of these terms that we use as part of the working group. So what is crisis collecting or rapid response collecting? So when we talk about these things, we're talking about gathering materials or documenting an event that requires some sort of rapid response to capture information about an event or an emergency. So this could refer to the collection of physical items, like those that appear at spontaneous memorials, like you see in the slide here, or digital content, like social media that might disappear, or even evolving news stories in which the versions of the content might evolve as time goes on. While most of what we will be talking today has to do with traumatic events or crises, I always like to point out that some collecting that requires a rapid response can actually be quite joyful, like when you win a national championship or when your community is celebrating some sort of milestone event. Trauma is the emotional or physical response to a stressful event or events. And it can be experienced by individuals or it can be experienced by entire communities. A traumatic event could involve a moment or an hour or even a period of years that causes feelings or of emotional or physical response. And it can be elicited by an individual or a group. One of the things that we have learned a little bit more about as part of the working group is this notion of vicarious or secondary trauma. This is the result of being exposed to or empathetically bearing witness to the trauma experiences of others. So this can happen when librarians or archivists are working with materials that have traumatic themes, or when our users are exposed to the content through research or exhibitions. So a trauma-informed approach assumes that most of us have had one or more traumatic events in our lives that fall within the experience of trauma, and it acknowledges that our staff, our volunteers, our visitors at museums, archives, libraries, other public history sites, that we all have these personal trauma histories that can affect how we engage with the materials and the collections. Some may have personal connections to traumatic experiences that are actually documented in an exhibition or in our collections. Most of us on the Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group serve on this group because we have been involved with documenting a tragedy or have worked with collections with traumatic content, and we know what it's like to try and respond in the moment when you're trying to deal with a lot of other things. We want to apply best practices, and we've also reached out to our colleagues for support, and we want to give some of that back. We recognize that talking about this can be difficult, and sometimes we need to step away from it. So when we're talking about crisis collections, it may elicit in our audience a strong emotional reaction. And if that happens to you today, we hope that you will feel free to step away from this webinar and give you the space that you need. All right, Vanessa, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Kara. So actually at this point, we have our first poll that we're going to launch today. We have 3 of these, I believe, throughout the course of today's presentation. And the first is going to be asking if you've ever participated in rapid response or crisis collecting, or if you've worked with collections that have contained traumatic content or themes. So Elisa, if you wouldn't mind launching that. Thanks very much. And as Kara mentioned when she was introducing some of these themes to us, that rapid response collecting isn't necessarily going to be around a traumatic event. It could be around, an exciting or joyous event at your institution or in your community. So that's something to keep in mind during this polling as well. All right, Elisa, have we had some answers come in? Terrific. So it actually looks like most folks have not participated in rapid response or crisis collecting. About 79% of you today have not had experience in this area. So hopefully today, Kara and I will be bringing some new information to you, some new ideas to consider. We always say, and Kara will talk about this later on in our session today, that it's not necessarily if, but when we'll be asked to engage in this type of work. In terms of working with collections that have traumatic content, far more of you have experience in that space. So very interesting to see that. Hopefully, again, some of the information that we'll be talking about today will be helpful to you in that work as you continue it, or if you're faced with that type of work again. Thank you all so much. So moving on. So as we mentioned, we wanted to give some background about the origins of the Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group. So many discussions had been happening in our field as more and more of our colleagues across the country and around the world were grappling with questions over how to and whether to document tragedy. The proposal for a formal task force within the Society of American Archivists grew out of discussions at the Diverse Sexuality and Gender section at our annual conference in 2017, specifically driven by responses to the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida in June of 2016. The Tragedy Response Initiative Task Force was formally created by SAA in January of 2018, and we served a 2-year term. For those interested in learning more about the ways in which the cultural heritage community responded to the Pulse nightclub shooting in particular, we would really encourage you to watch Whitney Broadway's, outstanding webinar, Collecting and Preserving After Tragedy, which was presented as part of Preservation Week in 2021. Whitney, I believe, is now the director of the Southeast Museum of Photography in Daytona Beach, Florida, but she did serve as collections manager at the Orange County Regional History Center in Orlando at the time of the Pulse tragedy. And her presentation in 21 is a discussion of the extensive rapid response collecting effort undertaken by the museum, as well as, and I should say that the work of Whitney and her colleagues has been incredibly influential to both the task force and the working group. So the charge of the task force, we were going to be responsible for creating and compiling resources for archivists facing a sudden tragedy, and as well as exploring the feasibility of a standing body within SAA that would create and update documentation and serve as a volunteer tragedy response team. The task force officially began its work in February of 2018 with a fact-finding period. We conducted interviews and made connections with colleagues to solicit feedback and gather materials that they'd created in their own responses to documenting tragedies. We distributed a survey that was designed by Kara that was shared with SAA membership as well as allied associations to determine their needs and what their initial thoughts were on this type of work. And we hosted a workshop of invited guests from other affiliated organizations and fields, including the American Association of Museums, the Oral History Association, the American Library Association, and National Heritage Responders. So that workshop generated questions about what resources were needed, how to approach the question of whether or not to collect, how to collect if you do choose to do so, as well as how to support archivists and volunteers experiencing that trauma directly or impacted by vicarious trauma. And then, of course, how best to support and work with the affected communities. There were two primary forms of output from the task force, the first of which was documenting in times of crisis, a resource kit, which was made available through SAA's website in September of 2019. We'll talk more about the resource kit in just a moment. And the second were a set of recommendations to Society of American Archivists Council. We focused on the feasibility of a standing body and response network for many of those recommendations. And through that, we envisioned a group that would provide remote assistance to colleagues via a hotline or a web form, but not necessarily provide in-person assistance to physically acquire, process, or preserve collections. The assistance that we did believe should be provided would focus on really humanizing the resource kit. So referring colleagues not only to those resources as well as others, but really opening a line of supportive communication and beginning to build a more formal community of practice around this type of collecting. We hoped that there would also be a focus on establishing best practices and a community of practice that considers the long-term implications of this type of collecting and our choices about whether or not to collect. So Kara is going to talk about the outcome of this second portion of the task force exploration later on today. The task force's final report was submitted to council in March of 2020, and they clearly saw and understood the continued and growing need for this type of body. And therefore, the Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group, which is a bit of a mouthful, that Kara and I are both honored to chair, was officially formed in August 2020. I do also want to say that this work has really been a labor of love for all of the members of the task force and now the members of the working group. The task force was honored to be recognized with an SAA Council resolution during the annual conference and business meeting in August of 2020. So bringing us up to today, the charge of the working group as it currently stands is to maintain and update the resource kit, develop and provide immediate and ongoing support and response assistance to archivists, allied cultural heritage professionals, and communities in times of crisis, and build partnerships with organizations and allied groups for the purposes of cultural stewardship and preservation around crisis collecting. So since commencing our inaugural term as a working group in January of 2021, we've met monthly to conduct this ongoing maintenance of the resource kit, develop and launch the crisis collecting assistance team, and coordinate and host open sessions during SAA's annual conference and business meetings, build relationships and collaborations with our allies in other organizations, and most recently begin a speaker series featuring colleagues from around the world who are engaged in this type of work. So to take us a bit deeper into the work of the working group, we wanted to spend some time today exploring documenting in times of crisis, a resource kit with you. Kara has dropped the link to this resource in the chat. Thank you for that, Kara. So the resource kit consists of over 30 documents that have been made freely available to archivists, cultural heritage and memory workers, and community members through the advocacy section of SAA's website. The kit is divided into various components and provides ready-for-use templates that can be customized for local use in consultation with communities, your administrators, and your legal counsel as necessary. In addition to templates, some sections also provide general guidance, links to resources for additional information, or suggestions about questions to consider before, during, and after a crisis. The sections include immediate response, collection management, administrative policies and agreements, digital content, emotional support, oral histories, and manuals and resources. So each section contains materials relevant to that specific topic where you're finding them, as well as strategies for acquiring material in various formats and coordinating the efforts of existing staff, as well as any volunteers or interim staff that might participate in a rapid response collecting effort. So the types of materials that you end up collecting may include items that are left at spontaneous memorial sites, oral histories and written first-person accounts, as well as both personal and official documentation of events and their aftermath and response. I do want to note that the resource kit also includes resources for assessing whether a collection response is the appropriate or feasible response to a specific event, as well as whether it's feasible or appropriate to the resources and mission of your organization. To get a bit deeper into what precisely is provided by the resource kit, we have some examples here on the screen, as well as a capture from one of our working group members who works at Berea College and how she's used some of these resources in her COVID-19 collecting initiative at her home institution. So many of the templates included in the resource kit are based on documentation that members of the group created for their own institution, much like our colleague at Berea here, in the wake of crises or tragedies, or documentation that was shared with the group by institutions and colleagues who also had experience documenting tragedies. So within the immediate response section, for example, you'll find things like a volunteer agreement form and inventory guidelines that deal with some of the specifics and particulars around the types of materials that tend to accumulate after a crisis or disaster. Within administrative policies and agreements, you'll find a collection policy template, as well as guidelines for crafting a collection policy around crisis collecting, as well as an anonymous donations accession policy. And this is designed specifically to account for materials that are mailed to your institution, sometimes just left on your doorstep or found at spontaneous memorial sites. The digital content section is one that's currently being looked at for updating, given the fact that so many new tools have developed since the original publication of the resource kit. Currently, you'll find things in this section like a digital submissions terms and conditions template, and a web content crawling or archiving permission form for use when you're dealing with site owners that you've identified as controlling a site that may be appropriate for archiving as part of your collections relevant to a disaster. The emotional support section is one that we're all particularly interested in expanding. As Kara mentioned, and when we were defining our terms, trauma-informed approaches and secondary or affiliated trauma are something that we get asked a lot of questions about in the work of this group. So currently, this section of the resource kit involves self-care, grief, trauma, and other types of resources, including information about third-party support systems and the responsibilities of managers and supervisors when supporting your staff, as well as tips for administrative support and links to national resources that you may find helpful. Finally, the oral history section includes things like standard release forms and copyright and licensing agreements. We find that oral histories are really key to documenting these types of events. So in terms of maintaining and updating the resource kit, the committee performs regular reviews of the resource kit to update broken links, make necessary edits, etc. And we're currently working to establish a regular review schedule to ensure that that continual maintenance is kept up to date. The working group is also currently conducting a review of recent research and resources for potential addition to the resource kit upon approval by SAA Council. We're also beginning the process of collaborating with colleagues outside of the working group to provide translations of selected resource kit content in Spanish. This is a pilot project that we hope will provide expanded access to these resources for the cultural heritage community and the communities that we serve. So since the resource kit's publication, we've had calls for editorial recommendations, such as correcting broken links, offering us suggestions for inclusion of additional resources. And these have been distributed through SAA section discussion boards. Contact information for providing suggestions is also available through the resource kit itself. And I believe Kara may have just dropped the link to our feedback form into the chat. So this feedback form is available on the SAA website and through SAA discussion boards as well, if you're a member of any of those. We're hoping to utilize the data and information from this feedback form and today's session to keep the resource kit as relevant as possible. So we'll take a little break now for our second poll of the day, which is going to ask you questions about which sections of the resource kit you found most helpful if you have used it, or if you haven't, which sections do you think would be the most useful? And then if you were interested in dropping into the chat, what sections you would like to see added to the resource kit in the future.
And we know that many of you may not have had a chance to look at this before, and that's totally fine. This may be the first time you are being exposed to it. But you can absolutely fill out the resource kit feedback form at any time. We're always eager to look for information about the ways that we can expand the resource kit to the widest possible audience to really create tools and templates that are going to be useful for everyone. So it looks like answers are still coming in, so we're just going to give it one more minute here before we share the results of the poll.
Excellent. So initial results here, it looks like our top score for either what has been most useful or what folks believe would be most useful to them is that immediate response piece. So we'll talk a bit later when Kara's talking about the crisis collecting assistance team in particular, about some interesting things that we've noticed about immediate response versus after some time has gone by and you've had a bit of time to reflect. But I know something that many of us on the working group as well have questions about is, what do you do on day one? So it's great to see that immediate response section either has been or hopefully will be helpful to many of you. And I did notice in the chat that Emily has mentioned that they would love to see a section on ethical practices and behaviors to observe during the process of collecting and describing. And yes, Emily, that is absolutely a piece that we are exploring as well. I know I'm very interested in this piece personally. We do provide some resources in the resource kit around some of these ethical questions. We also have a fairly robust works cited bibliography that is helpful for reference around scholarship that's been happening in the field. And as Kara mentions, Documenting the Now has does a great job related to ethics and social media in particular.
But it's an area that we talk about too, like the ethics even of collecting. Like there are ethical considerations to be made when people are experiencing tragedy. Like, is it appropriate for you to be taking things off of their social media posts? Is it appropriate to be asking your staff to be doing some of that work? And one of the things that we have discussed amongst ourselves, we sort of use each other as sounding boards. And a number of us, while we have been serving on the working group, have experienced tragedies at our institutions, and really sort of thinking about, does it make sense to collect now? What's the impact on the staff? How much time should we ask the staff? And we can talk about that more a little bit later at the end. I realize I'm going on, but this is an area I'm really interested in, Emily. So I'm glad you brought it up.
I think it also transitions really nicely into the next portion of what we wanted to talk with you all about today, which is how you can try to prepare in advance for a crisis, a disaster, a tragedy, a rapid response collecting effort. So although these events can always take a number of forms, and it can be difficult, if not impossible, to fully prepare for the individual and community impact of a specific trauma, there are some ways in which you can position your organization to be prepared for possible rapid response collecting in the event that you are impacted by a tragedy or disaster in particular. Kara and I were talking earlier, and we said that you might think of these steps as reframing a conversation with which we are all hopefully already familiar as cultural heritage professionals, and especially during Preservation Week, which is that just as you have a disaster preparedness plan in place in the event of harm to your collections from, say, a flood or a fire, you may want to think of this as developing the outline of a crisis preparedness plan. So a few key steps here. The first of which would be to identify what planning resources are available to you. So of course, the resource kit, as we've mentioned, includes a tragedy response preparedness checklist among some of its resources. And this checklist comes with a range of questions, conversation starters, and considerations for beginning the process of developing this crisis preparedness plan. This document also includes sections on considerations for the immediate aftermath of a tragedy or crisis, once the specifics of your circumstances can be ascertained, as well as guidance for the period following rapid response collecting efforts and the long-term use and care of crisis-affiliated collections. In developing this particular document, we drew heavily from several excellent resources developed by colleagues, particularly Ashley Maynor's Essential Questions for Managers of Condolence Archives, which I believe is linked in that bibliography that we were just mentioning, and I really cannot recommend it highly enough. So after identifying your planning resources, you'll want to assess your existing resources and responsibilities. So this is where you'll ask yourself, is collecting a feasible, appropriate, and sustainable response for your institution and community? You'll want to consider the mission of your organization, the desired impact and use of a potential collection in the future, as well as how that collection, by whom that collection might be used. So does your organization possess the physical and or the digital space, the personnel, the financial resources, and other resources and personnel necessary to acquire, preserve, and provide access to a collection dedicated to a specific event or tragedy? If you decide that developing a collection is not possible or preferred, what are the other ways in which your organization might offer support in the aftermath of a tragedy? If the decision is made to collect in certain situations, who's going to be responsible for that collecting? What infrastructure and resources are you likely to need? So staff, space, technology. What documentation will you need? Specialized deeds of gift, anonymous donation forms, those web crawling and archiving permissions forms that we mentioned earlier. And most importantly, perhaps, how will you support staff and volunteers engaging with the materials? Will you provide special training? Will you help them identify emotional support resources? These are huge questions to ask yourself, but this is why we say, try and have these conversations in advance, even if it's just with yourself. Next, you'll want to work on building your network. So determine who you need to contact for support in the event of a crisis. Examples might include emergency preparedness entities at your institution. Maybe you have a marketing and public relations team that you can work with to help spread the word about and provide education about the goals and plans of a rapid response collecting effort. So as Kara mentioned, is it appropriate to be retrieving materials from a spontaneous memorial? A marketing or public relations team can really help you with that messaging. You'll, of course, want to talk to your IT personnel if you plan on collecting digital materials. And of course, you'll need buy-in from your institutional leadership. So you'll also want to determine who your potential partners are. For example, are there other institutions in your area or region that may also be collecting? Are you a member of a consortial group? Are there community organizations that you can work with as well as support? And then what types of organizations or agencies fund this type of work? You'll also want to make sure that you're creating documentation. So although this documentation will likely need to be adapted to the specific needs of the given crisis, disaster, or tragedy to which you are responding, reviewing things like your existing collection policies, your deeds of gift, and permission and agreement forms, or if necessary, creating documents for specific use in a rapid response content can be incredibly useful. So again, the resource kit also includes templates and guidelines for creating or adapting these documents and others to address some of the unique needs of crisis collecting. You may also want to produce some procedural and workflow documents that will provide a general overview of your ideal response scenario. Keeping this document simple and easily accessible should be your main goal. It may include lists of key contacts, the potential delegation of responsibilities, and the like. You'll of course want to remain open to the fact that this is your ideal and not necessarily how things would actually play out in the event of a crisis or a tragedy, but it gives you some framework. And last but not least, you'll want to find resources for staff support. So as we've been mentioning throughout, and as many of us, it seems, have already experienced, the affiliated trauma for staff and volunteers responsible for working with these types of collections needs to be a key component of any response effort. Your staff and colleagues may also be directly impacted by the crisis or tragedy that you're documenting, and it's essential that you keep that in mind. It's also important to remember that there is no timeline for trauma. So once the initial collecting phase has ended, there may still be a need for additional support resources for those who are processing the materials or facilitating access to and education about the resulting collections. And then in addition to the need for emotional support, you might also just have questions about best practices, or you may want to speak with someone with experience documenting a crisis or tragedy at their separate organization. So identify what resources are available from trained professionals for emotional and psychological support for yourself and your team, whether this be local, regional, or even national support networks. And in a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Kara to speak about how the working group can offer personalized support for navigating those collecting logistics and best practices questions. So while creating your preparedness plan or engaging in conversations around crisis collecting, again, it's important to remember that all of these situations may not merit the same response, and that each decision to collect or not to collect, or the scope of a collecting initiative in response to a given event, should always be trauma informed and center on care for your staff and the affected community, as well as consider the factors that contribute to the ethical and responsible care of collections over the long term. Kara, I will pass things over to you to introduce us to the Crisis Collecting Assistance Team.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Before we shift there, I just want to highlight one of my favorite new documents on the resource kit is under the emotional support section. And it's difficult to send an actual link because it's a PDF, but the UK and Ireland Archives and Record Association emotional support guides are absolutely superb one-page documents about how to support your staff, how to support researchers, and I've just found them to be just absolutely amazing. So I like to share that with just about everybody I can because I just love their resources. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Crisis Collecting Assistance Team. Next slide, please. So as Vanessa noted, part of the original charge of the task force initiative was to investigate the viability of a tragedy response team, a disaster recovery team for this kind of work. The task force investigated how others staffed similar programs and with what technologies. We were really concerned about sustainability, and initially we hoped we could find another program where we could actually piggyback on their efforts and not invent something new. So we reached out to other organizations doing similar work, But for a variety of reasons, we couldn't come up with anything that quite meshed. The mission of our group was just that much different enough from the other organizations that we realized we needed to do something independently. We ran out of time to actually implement any sort of program during the tenure of the task force, but this has been one of the new working group's primary goals since our creation. And so what we've come up with is something called the Crisis Collecting Assistance Team. Next slide. Currently, the Crisis Collecting Assistance Team, or CCAT for short, is staffed by members of the working group. We've talked about expanding to former members of the working group, or perhaps seeking additional volunteers who have expertise in areas that are not covered by the current working group. But there are some challenges to that. We need to develop additional training to ensure consistent response. We need to make sure that we stay within the very narrow scope that we have been given. We don't say give disaster recovery advice, for example. Although we can direct people to resources for those sorts of things, but that's not our area of expertise. And also, like, just keeping folks apprised of the changes of the work and the information we're providing would be hard to do if we expanded out beyond the working group. So for now, it's just the 8 or 9 of us who serve on the working group, and we're scheduled 2 weeks at a time with a primary responder and a secondary responder. So the secondary responder is meant to be a backup for when the primary is not available or is on vacation. One example I always like to give of when the secondary responder, or the utility of the secondary responder, is that I was scheduled to be on call during the anniversary of a tragedy in my family. Now, mindful of my own need for self-care, I asked if my backup would take point on that day so I didn't have to worry about being online. The secondary responder also can be sort of the first person to go to as a sounding board for a response. One of the things I really want to emphasize is that you do not need to be a member of the Society of American Archivists to get help from us. We assist anybody who reaches out. Library, archives workers, archival and cultural heritage institutions, community members documenting or experiencing a crisis. All we ask from folks is that they fill out a form with some very basic contact info and a brief description of the type of assistance that they are seeking. Once that form's submitted, an audio response assures the submitter that the form's been received. It provides some initial links and lets them know we'll be in touch within 72 business hours. Now, in reality, we usually respond much sooner than that. But occasionally stuff comes up and we wanted to give ourselves the flexibility there. Some of the biggest resources for the team is each other and the experiences that we've all been through. We volunteered for the working group because we all had experiences doing the work and sometimes assisting others trying to do the work. One of the things we discovered is that this, because some institutions have gotten a lot of press related to their work documenting tragedies, they were the people that were called upon again and again when others were trying to do similar kinds of things. And that in itself can be traumatizing. And I never knew any group who said no when someone called and asked for their help. But I know for a fact that for some of them, talking about the collecting work they did is emotionally difficult and they don't want to do it anymore. It's not good for their mental health. So we really wanted to create a group that was in a place where they felt like they could be that resource for someone else, so that we weren't constantly sort of asking the same people to relive those what can be difficult circumstances. We've created template responses for different types of answers. And so this provides folks with some immediate first steps, regardless of the expertise of the person who's the primary responder. It also allows for consistent messaging. That being said, the primary responder is not the only one who's responsible for answering questions during that time. They do the initial reference interview to determine if further expertise is needed, but they can always reach out to the rest of the team. And if the rest of the team doesn't have the expertise that's needed, we know enough people who have done this work in a very broad sense that we can usually reach out. So for example, right now, we don't have a ton of people on the working group who have a lot of experience with oral histories. So when those questions come up, we reach out to those in our network who we know have had experience doing that work. Each team member lists the areas of expertise that they feel comfortable with so that it's easy to sort of reach out and get additional resources. And sometimes we just, before we respond to the initial query, we brainstorm and come up with new resources that maybe weren't on our toolkit or that meet the particular circumstances of the person who's making the request. All right, let's do poll number 3. So I know that only about 20% of you said that you had actually engaged in this kind of work. So in this case, if you haven't actually engaged in this type of work, you can check anything off if this is something you anticipate you might be collecting around in the future. And so these are just sort of some examples of what those categories are. One of the things that we have discovered as the working group has evolved is that it came about in the time of COVID. And so a lot of institutions who'd never done any of this work before did in fact collect around the pandemic and that impact on their communities. And so we've actually seen a real rise in people collecting in this area than maybe we might have in 2018 or 2019. And I do want to point out that we do in the poll, we've highlighted at the very bottom sort of that positive rapid response need. I continue to sort of emphasize that this work doesn't have to just be about the stuff that's tough and hard. We're going to give it just a couple more seconds here to see if anybody else responds, and then we'll share the poll. All right, so it looks like I love the fact that you all highlight that 2/3 of you said that community or institution celebration, either you've collected around those things or you might. Again, it's really important to me. This work can be emotionally draining, and it's good to remember that the tools we use for those circumstances can also be applied to the positive. The other thing, not a surprise to me, is that pandemic or health crises is an area that more than half of you either have collected in or anticipate collecting. And then we've got some things related to natural disaster, to student movements, social movements. Unfortunately, things like mass shootings is one that many of us have had to grapple with collecting around, and just a couple of you have documented related to acts of terror. Thanks so much for filling that poll out. So with that in mind, if we can go to the next slide, we can talk about some of the questions that we've answered as part of CCAT. So we did a soft launch in early January of 2022, an official launch of February of that year. It's interesting, when we first started talking about this, some folks in the working group and folks in the administration of the Society of American Archivists were really concerned that we were going to get overwhelmed. Now, I have run a disaster hotline for collections related disasters, and I never was overwhelmed when I worked that hotline. And so I was pretty sure we were not going to be overwhelmed. And that has been, so far, that has not been the case. I have been correct that we have not been overwhelmed by so many requests that we can't respond. And I think, one of the interesting things we've discovered is that while there very much is a need for folks to have somewhere to go to reach out to in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, for just as many, if not more, they actually wait and reach out to us much later. So for us and for the questions we've had, many of them have centered around documenting a devastating weather event. Some of the questions related to that have to do with how you collect social media. And as Vanessa has already talked about a little bit, it's a constant challenge because platforms in terms of use are always changing in that arena. Others come to us looking for advice about the best ways to reach out into the community to actually collect things resulting in the surrounding community. And that's one of those places where, as Vanessa noted earlier, sort of setting up your network in advance and making those connections is helpful when you actually do then want to do community collecting. And then another area, another theme has been, how do we best support staff, or how do you yourselves do the work when you and folks around you are struggling to get basic needs met, like there's no electricity, or there's not enough water, or the internet is down. And so we've answered some of those questions over the phone, not using internet. Another area that we've received a lot of information about and that we've discussed within the working group, because it's important to us, is how do we support colleagues who are working with collections with traumatic themes? I will say that that is the area that I, as a manager, was the least prepared to deal with, was how to best support my staff, how to minimize the long-term impact of looking at content that was so brutal and ugly and horrifying. And so we've gotten a lot of questions related to that, and we've talked through and workshopped a lot of best practices and looked for places. That's why I love that those resources from the UK and Ireland. I just think they're so great. Another issue that we talked about a little bit before is when and if to collect. It is absolutely appropriate to make the decision to not collect, or to not collect in the immediate aftermath, so that you can take care of your people and your families, your communities. Yes, some material may be lost, but there's always going to be something available to collect later if you change your mind. And in fact, for some people, they're not ready to donate or to give their materials until much later. I think the timeline is, and Vanessa can confirm this, I read this somewhere, it's about 75 years, basically the lifetime of a person. And after that, there's usually a lot less, but there are sort of these touchstones, and for up to 75 years, there are times where it's appropriate to be collecting. So maybe you don't do it in the first 24 hours or the first week or the first month. And then we've had some questions, I think I mentioned this before, about training for those who are conducting oral histories and how they might be trauma aware as they move into that. What are the legal kinds of agreements they need to have so they have permission to use and to preserve the content, that sort of thing. Next slide. So what are the things that we're working on right now? Well, one of the things we're doing is we spent last year sort of seeing how it worked, and now we want to share the news of this group, of this team, to the rest of the world. That's why we're doing presentations like this one. We're really interested in reaching out to regional and national professional associations and consortia, and groups that represent allied professionals in other areas. We love to talk about this work. It's really important to us. For some of us, it is some of the most meaningful work that we do, and we want people to know about it so that they have a resource that they can go to. We are working on a quarterly series this year that's open to everyone, that pulls from the international community, where we bring others from around the world doing similar sorts of work into an information exchange. So in March of this year, we sponsored a talk on archiving disaster support groups, which you can find on our website. We have a recording of that. And in June, we'll focus on those who are implementing trauma-informed practices in archives. And again, you can sign up for that. That's open to everyone. We are also talking about how we might expand CCAT in response to potential needs. We're working with some groups who are helping us translate portions of the resource kit into Spanish. And we are, asking people like you all, what else is needed? What's missing? Where can we expand? And we are definitely happy to talk at conferences, webinars like this. You know, what are the ways that we can reach out and get feedback from the cultural heritage community about the gaps in the work that we're doing? So that brings us to our last slide, in which I just want to say, first of all, thank you for being here today. And also, you know, we hope you will never need our services. But if you do, know that we are here to help. We've provided some key resources on this page, which we can throw into the chat. And we've got a few minutes, hopefully, to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thanks, Karen, Vanessa. That was riveting for me, and just wonderful to see so many resources and to hear about your experiences and the work you're planning. It's very exciting. So we have some time for questions, and I did not see any questions in the Q&A. There may be other points you'd like to talk about for a minute or two.
It looks like some things are maybe starting to pop in now.
They are.
So it looks like a question about the name of the UK organization that has the resources that you raved about, Kara. Do you happen to have those pulled up? I have them printed in front of me. So it's the UK and Ireland Archives and Records Administration, I believe. Is that correct, Kara?
I think so.
Okay. So they are linked through the resource kit. As Kara mentioned, they're in the emotional support resources section. They're actually our newest addition to the resource kit. So they're the bottom most resource in that section. And there's 3 of them. They're terrific PDFs, and they're numbered support guide 1, support guide 2, and support guide 3. So they have some terrific exercises that you can work through sort of in an order that builds on one another. Perfect. Thank you for dropping those into the chat, Kara.
So I see there's a question here about, could you talk or mention specifically some disasters or crises that you've worked on? Sure. So, I've worked on everything as diverse as we had the president of our university who was asked to resign on a Sunday morning. And there was a variety of protests surrounding the circumstances under which she was asked to resign and then her reinstatement. That sort of got my feet wet in some of this work. And then UVA was put in the news again a few years later, a Rolling Stones article that was later retracted, called A Rape on Campus, that obviously stirred up a lot of turmoil and bad memories for many members of our community as we tried to reconcile with that kind of trauma that happened on across the university. And then in 2017, white supremacists came to Charlottesville to protest the removal of Confederate monuments that ended up in 3 deaths and many injuries, including one of my library colleagues. And then just recently, last November, we had to deal with a mass shooting on campus. So that is just me at the University of Virginia. And that's not even all of the items, all of the events that we've had to collect. And then Vanessa, do you want to talk a little bit about your work? Because it's a little bit different.
Yeah, so my, as Anne mentioned in our introductions, the first part of my title is Pan Am 103 Archivist. So Syracuse University lost 35 study abroad students in the 1988 terrorist bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. So that was before my time here at the university, but in my day-to-day, I have primary responsibility for everything having to do with the collections around that disaster. So not only memorial collections from the families, but also materials that document the trial, resulting aviation security legislation, the working files of the transatlantic investigative team. So there's a whole breadth of material there. Hence my interest in, we're about to mark the 35th anniversary of that event this coming December. So hence my interest in what does the long term look like for these types of collections, when we're 10, 20, 30 plus years down the road, how are they integrated into our teaching, into our community memorializations of an event, especially as those who were most directly affected start to leave us as well. In addition to that, Kara, my list of things that we've had to respond to here at SU is much shorter than UVA's. Most recently, we have had quite a bit of student activism here on campus, and I am fortunate to now have a colleague who works with Project Stand, and so really, like I say, fortunate to have that expertise and to draw on some of her experience in how to encourage students to document their own student activism, but particularly right before COVID-19 hit, we had two quite lengthy student occupations of campus buildings resulting from university handling of incidents of hate speech on campus. So there were a lot of questions about what's appropriate to collect and how to go about collecting it. So definitely an area there that I'm sure a lot are experiencing. I do want us to be mindful of time, and I know that we have questions rolling in. It is 3 o'clock. Kara and I are committed to answering any questions that we didn't have time to answer today via email. So hopefully Anne, Mia, and Elisa, you can help make that happen.
Thank you very much. Excuse me for a second. So I'll just proceed here. Thanks to our presenters, Kara and Vanessa, the core webinar technical support, Elisa Nachman, and the office staff, Julie Reese, Tom Fairman, and Mia Blix-Sheehan. You're welcome to join CORE. We're very excited to have a possibility of having some new members join for some access to past webinars and many other benefits. We have some upcoming education events. The next webinar will be this Thursday, May 4th for Preservation Week, and is titled Networking Strategies to Improve Disaster Readiness, presented by Steve Pine. Upcoming courses are Fundamentals of Acquisitions and a related course, Fundamentals of Electronic Resource Acquisitions. And upcoming classroom and e-forums, Slow Librarianship, a community practice on May 23rd and 24th, and the core classroom, Building Our Strengths Together from August 14th to September 1st, 2023. Thanks again for attending the webinar. We're very happy to have had you, and thanks again to Vanessa and Kara. This concludes our presentation.